Thanks for joining us for our Chamber Connection podcast. Thanks to our friends at Speakeasy, we are here for the next 52 weeks, bringing you guests from around our community, elected officials, business owners, folks doing great work here in Macomb County. So sit back, take a listen, and we hope you'll join us every week for our Chamber Connection. Good morning, and thanks for joining us for this edition of the Chamber Connection. I'm Stacey Ziarko, President and CEO of the Sterling Heights Regional Chamber of Commerce, and we are here today for our next episode featuring Keith Jablonski, attorney from O'Reilly Rancilio, who not only, we share a parking lot, don't we?
Yes,
So
we do.
Keith, thanks for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Absolutely. We are very excited. Keith's family and my family go way back to our childhood days in elementary school, so it's fun always to have old friends on the podcast. So tell me a little bit about you, and then tell me a little bit about O'Reilly Rancilio.
Sure. Well, again, thank you. And let's not stress the word old too much because
Right,
people
we
might
are
get the
not
wrong
old.
idea. I'm a lifelong Macomb County resident. I live in Macomb Township currently with my family. I have a wife, Tina, and we have 3 kids. One is a sophomore.
That scares me.
Yeah,
He's in high school already.
that's Luke. And then I have Jake, who's a 7th grader, and Ella, who's a 5th grader.
I get to see them often in the building between sports practices from time to
They
time.
do. We're on the go. We're on the go with them.
So O'Reilly Rancilio has a long history in Macomb County. So tell us a little bit about the firm and how it got started.
So the firm goes back to the late 1960s, and it's a wonderful symmetry that the firm has with the city of Sterling Heights, and it's been a long-standing partnership with the city. Going back to the days of Paul O'Reilly and Ken Rancilio when they founded the firm, and thus the name.
And Sterling was still a township and not even a city.
Right. And thankfully, our firm has had the beneficial relationship with the city of Sterling Heights since that time continuously, and we obviously look forward to continuing that relationship with the city.
You guys are great chamber members to us as well. We're always able to refer clients to you and send them your way, whether it's some of our nonprofit clients. We have a new business in Shelby Township that was looking for local representation. So we love having good partnerships. Again, we share a parking lot, and we use some of your conference space from time to time. So tell us a little bit about your specialty of law and what you do
Sure.
at the firm.
Sure. So I have what I would say is a mixed bag. I am a general business practitioner. I have a focus on commercial litigation. I also do some real estate work, whether it be transactional or real estate litigation. I also do a fair amount of landlord-tenant work.
So you had mentioned earlier today, this morning, as we were prepping, that there's some new changes to the landlord-tenant laws in the state of Michigan. Can you talk about those? And I will be in full disclosure, know nothing about this, so I might have lots of questions.
So it's a bit of a brave new world.
Okay.
Like a lot of businesses, like a lot of things in general, the pandemic, COVID,
Changed all
right?
of us.
COVID. So it changed sort of the landscape of the landlord-tenant law in Michigan, and it started with a lot of things with the 2020, where things had to happen. Emergency orders were enacted. Obviously, Governor Whitmer did things she did, but at the county level and at the state court level, a lot of orders were put into effect. In particular, with regard to landlord-tenant law, we had emergency orders which put a moratorium on evictions. And just so people understand, the moratorium was necessary, I think. I think all parties would agree that at the outset of the pandemic, when people were told they had to stay home,
We had no idea what was going to happen.
and right, everyone was just scrambling to worry about the next few days and to stop the spread and everything that was happening. So what happened is the courts, in essence, shut down. In-person court proceedings were not happening, and at the state level, the State Court Administrator's Office, which is part of the Michigan Supreme Court, issued some executive orders that basically said no landlords can take actions to evict tenants. And on the residential side, it made sense, right? You're telling people they can't go to work, they can't go anywhere. they have to stay in their homes. And so if you then say, well, except, if you're renting, then your landlord can come in and throw you out on the street. That would have not been any good for anyone.
Right.
But then what we've had is now we're 2.5 years from that.
Seems like yesterday some days.
Seems like yesterday, and then sometimes it seems like
a lifetime.
A lifetime, right? But so now what we have is, and this is both on the commercial and the residential side. So in my practice, I do both. I often and most typically represent landlords in residential landlord-tenant matters. So just in case you care, what that means is I will represent a landlord, and sometimes people think that makes me the bad guy. But there's a fine line, right?
Sure,
because you
absolutely.
have, if you have a tenant who is just staying in an apartment or a house, the landlord, if they're not receiving rent, and if the dwelling isn't being taken care of, the landlord has an investment in that property, and typically they have a mortgage to pay, which is due no matter what, regardless of whether the tenant is paying. They have to pay insurance, property taxes. Those are things that have to be paid. So when I do residential landlord-tenant work, I represent landlords. On the commercial side, that could be residential, or that could be, landlord side or tenant side. You get a lot more interesting cases on the commercial side.
So for a lot of the businesses that are members of the chamber, they might be in a strip mall. They might have a landlord. What does this mean for them?
Well, so what you have is, and that's the typical case, right? On the commercial side, you have, you may have one large building and several tenants, and they each occupy a suite. Typically, those tenants are responsible for not only their rent, but also what are called common area maintenance charges, CAM. Those are community charges for the entire complex: snow removal, landscaping, parking lot maintenance, oftentimes water, oftentimes electricity. It just depends on the type of building. But on the commercial side, we've in essence seen a return to normal. When I say normal, I mean we're kind of back to where we were prior to COVID. At least in terms of the way disputes are handled in the courts. Now, normal is a little different when you're talking about businesses and their viability. And so you do see an uptick in commercial landlord-tenant cases because businesses are, some have come back strong, some prospered, right, during the pandemic.
Absolutely.
Because of the nature of their business. But a lot are suffering. A lot of businesses just went out of business. Yeah. And so what you find is tenants where they're saying, look, my business isn't making it. We're not going to make it, and they'll turn over the keys. And so what I'm seeing a lot of is landlords saying, well, look, that's all well and good that the tenant,
vacated
and moved out. But what about the rent? Because they were on the hook for a lease for 3 more years. And so that's the type of issue that I'm seeing more of on the commercial side.
So from a business perspective, I'm in a mall. I'm in a commercial property with 5 other people. I have a leak in my roof. Who's responsible for the maintenance?
Interesting question. And
it came up the other day. That's why I'm asking.
Well, so here, people insert your lawyer jokes now, right? But the question is maybe, or the answer, I'm sorry, is maybe the landlord, maybe the tenant, somebody, and that's why we get involved. But in all seriousness, the first thing we're going to look at is the lease. Okay, so in every commercial space, there ought to be a signed written lease, and
I hope so. I hope their attorneys looked at it too.
You'd be surprised that you get clients or potential clients that come to you and say, well, no, it was just a handshake. And that's all well and good. And oftentimes it's people that know each other until there's a leak, right? And so who's responsible for the leak? Typically, if you have a leak coming from outside the premises, so it's a roof leak, right?
Sure.
Typically, landlords are responsible for a roof leak. Now, the lease could provide otherwise. The lease might say that the tenant is responsible for maintaining the roof. It might say that the landlord is responsible for repairs, but the tenant has to keep it maintained. So now you get into an issue where we're already into a lawsuit, right? Because now the landlord is going to say, well, look, tenant, where are your maintenance records for the last 5 years? Did you pay somebody to come and inspect the roof and make sure that there were no small leaks? Oh, you didn't? So now, after 5 years, there's a big leak.
There's a big, it's coming in.
So, but you know, I think the short answer is the lease. The lease.
From a small business perspective, because you work with a lot of business owners, what is something that they, besides, you know, clearly having a signed lease between them and a landlord, what is one thing that a landlord and a tenant should both be doing kind of going into a new venture? I've got a great idea. I'm going to open a storefront. How do I start and what should I have in place?
The lease. No.
And no handshake.
So that's where it starts, but it needs to be clear. Just like anything, just like any relationship, right? A couple talks about getting married. What happens before that? Sure, the ring is beautiful. The wedding planning is wonderful, but couples typically, and you know, not that I'm giving marriage advice, but
I'm gonna call
typically,
Tina.
yeah, right. Ask Tina; she'll tell you. They'll talk about, do we want to have children? Where do we want to live? What type of religion will we practice? How will we handle holidays? All those things that may not be the easiest things to discuss, but they get talked about up front. So now you talk about landlords and tenants. Who's going to be responsible for the insurance, the real estate taxes? Is it what we call a triple net lease, which is common parlance for the tenant being responsible for rent, taxes, insurance? That's kind of the default, I guess. But other things like what we talked about, who's going to be responsible for the roof? Who's responsible if it's a strip mall and on a Saturday night a kid drives by and throws a rock through the window?
Absolutely. All of these scenarios are things that will happen and have happened.
Yes. And the older you get, the more you see, right? So yeah.
So one of the things that happened during the pandemic is, you know, a lot of businesses, like you said, were struggling. Some of them couldn't afford to pay their rent. They weren't getting PPP loans, and they might have approached a landlord for, you know, deferment or discounted rates. Some of the landlords were saying that wasn't possible, because like you mentioned, they have a mortgage to pay as well. What are some scenarios that people, maybe they're in arrears for their rent and working with their landlord now, that they have in place? What are some things they can do or should be doing?
Well, so oftentimes what we see is the just like you said, the tenant rightfully had trouble. Their business wasn't doing what it was, and they'll go to the landlord and say, "Look, I know we were behind." And you figure out, first of all, okay, what's owed? Can we agree on that? That's step one. And then oftentimes the tenants will come up with a payment plan which starts with them paying current rent. So say, for example, the rent is $10,000 a month and they owe $100,000. A tenant will say, look, I'm going to pay $15,000 each month going forward. And so each month they're knocking $5,000 off of that balance. That's just a working example, obviously.
We've talked about commercial, but you also mentioned that this impacted residential as well. Moratorium has ended, correct?
That's correct.
So let's look at this too from a tenant perspective. I'm renting a house from somebody, and I'm paying them rent, but I have a leaky faucet that I just can't get fixed, or I have no heat, or any of these examples, and my landlord isn't doing their part. What are some things that a resident can do, a renter can do?
Well,
or should
tenants are entitled under the law to have a habitable dwelling, okay? And that's going to be something that's contained within every residential lease, whether or not it's written or not. So Michigan statutes protect tenants in those circumstances. So if we live in Michigan, it gets very cold in the winter. If there is no functioning heat, that's something that a landlord's required to provide. Tenants, on the other hand, are required to give prompt notice. Oftentimes what we run into is there's a chicken or egg. And so, and perhaps I have a landlord's perspective, but the tenant will be not paying rent. The landlord will ask why, or the landlord will hire someone like me to send a notice, and then we hear from the tenant. And the tenant says, well, the heat hasn't been working for the last 3 weeks. And the landlord says, well, that's news to me. I don't understand. It's winter. If the heat weren't working, wouldn't you have let me know?
Right.
If that were true, most landlords I've found to be very upstanding and honorable. They will take care of things like that. They and nobody, I think, wants a family to be sitting in freezing cold during the winter, or to not have functioning water. So it's a challenge, but what we've seen lately is two things. One, you have a ton of cases now because there was a moratorium.
You're backlogged. You've got to be backlogged.
And the courts are struggling. The court staffs are, they haven't increased, right? So you have the same amount of people working. They're, for the most part, back to work and courts are open. But you have double or triple the cases because all these cases that couldn't be filed are now being filed. And so it's taking a long time, and no fault of the courts. It's just the nature of what's happening. But it's taking a long time to get hearings scheduled. And then once you're there, what I've found is, this goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Our Supreme Court has the authority, the Michigan Supreme Court has the authority over all the courts in the state. And with that authority, they are able to direct how cases are processed. Well, what they did is they put a rule into place during the pandemic that said the first hearing in any eviction case was to be treated as a pretrial. And what that does is it gives the tenant extra opportunity, I think is the best way to put it, to make sure they're aware, to have the time. Oftentimes, it's envisioned that the tenant can still go and avail themselves of some federal funding under the CARES Act.
Sure.
And so tenants are getting a lot more time. It's frustrating for landlords, I can tell you that. I talk to a lot of them.
So I think, too, when we talked moratorium, it was a moratorium on eviction, correct? It was not a moratorium on rent. So your rent was still due.
Yep.
Or at the end, let's say, of the moratorium, there might have been a backlog of rent. Is that kind of accurate?
That is accurate. No different than, mortgage lenders.
Sure.
Some of them were giving borrowers a relief in terms of suspension of monthly payments, but it didn't mean that the payments weren't still due. The payments were still accruing. They just weren't due.
Kind of kicking a can down the road.
Kicking the can down the road. That's exactly right. And it's no different than what the student loan lenders did.
Yep.
I mean, it was 2 years where borrowers didn't have to make payments, but those payments were still there. The same principle applies to rent. What though a lot of tenants were able to do, like I said earlier, was avail themselves of the CARES Act. And under the CARES Act, rent is being paid by the federal government, and so a lot of tenants were able to, and there was a vetting process. They had to go and prove that they weren't working or weren't able to work, or things of that nature. But that helped because it sort of helped both sides.
And what are you seeing from the courts now? I'm sure there's not an overall percentage of cases that are going in favor of a landlord or a tenant, but how are the courts kind of, or is it too soon in the process because they're so backlogged?
No, I think courts are frustrated, I think is maybe the first word I would use. It's just there's such a large volume. But beyond that, I'm seeing judges wanting to do everything possible within the bounds of the law, of course, to make sure that people aren't being evicted. Sure. I think there's that sentiment. And so within that, of course, judges will follow the law, but tenants are getting, I would say, every opportunity to make good on their obligations. Now, sometimes someone simply can't pay the rent, and it's just time for a change.
Sure. What do you think is coming down next from the state? What do you see the future of kind of some of these tenant and landlord scenarios that people need to be looking for, that people need to have on the horizon?
I think that the biggest change is the proliferation of Zoom. So most hearings, at least the preliminary hearings, are being conducted via Zoom still, even though most courts are open for in-person proceedings.
I sat in court for Leadership Macomb a couple months ago, and we sat in a Zoom courtroom, which I think he went through 15 to 20 cases in the matter of an hour. Some of those early hearings, not necessarily where it was like, yes, no, here's my representation, right. And it was impressive.
And some judges are really good, have become very, very proficient with it. Some judges hate it. I've talked to judges that are on both sides where,
if I never do another Zoom meeting, I am okay with that. Yeah, but I understand that there's some necessity for them.
Yeah, and I think probably the answer is somewhere in the middle, right? Being in litigation, it is a nice luxury for me if I have more than one matter on a particular day to be able to sit in my office and go into a Zoom and then have another Zoom. I can't physically be in Detroit and Mount Clemens.
I was going to say, does that right? That gives you the ability to probably get more accomplished?
Yes. On the other hand, I do think that as a litigator, part of the true nature of what we do is going back to the basics, question and answer. What you're doing here.
Yep.
And I think there's no substitute for being in person.
I agreed for that.
So that's how I feel.
Well, Keith, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
You.
I hope that our businesses and businesses in Sterling Heights really got some great information this morning. I did, because we get random phone calls all the time that now I have some ability to, know enough just to be dangerous.
Yeah.
Yes, and send them your way. Keith, thanks so much. And join us for the next edition of our Chamber Connection. Thanks for tuning in to the Chamber Connection. Be sure to check out information on the Sterling Heights Regional Chamber of Commerce website, our Facebook page, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We look forward to you connecting with us and tuning in next week.